Hi, I'm Steve Sleeper, the producer of the North Omaha History Podcast. Adam and I have always wanted to record some episodes in front of a live audience, and we got that chance a while back. The one you're about to hear is the history of hospitals in North Omaha. Our thanks to Lamb of God Lutheran Church in Papillion for letting us use their facility, and also thanks to our patrons. They're listed in the show notes. Now, on with the show.
Welcome to the North Omaha History Podcast with noted author and historian Adam Fletcher Sassy. Each week, Adam takes you on a guided tour through Omaha's dynamic past.
On Adam's blog, North Omaha includes all the area in Douglas County, Nebraska, north of Dodge Street and east of North 72nd Street. In this history of North Omaha, there have been at least a dozen hospitals within these boundaries. They were religious and non-secular, charities and businesses segregated and mixed race. Some were run by African Americans, others by Jews, others still by Scandinavians. Today, there's only one left. Tell us more, Adam.
Steve, it goes back. It goes back to that wagon ride where you broke your leg along the way and then you died because you couldn't get help. Until you got to Omaha. If you happened to break your leg getting off that ferry, you could find a doctor. But every doctor at that point operated in the beginning, in the 1850s. They all operated out of the storefront, usually attached to their house. Eventually, they started making house calls to your house. Depending on how far you lived, you might die or not from that broken leg. It is hard to say. Somewhere along the way, though, right around the 1860s and 70s, late 60s, early 70s, Omaha had its first hospitals come around. And these hospitals they weren't what we think of as a hospital. Originally, they were in a storefront. The storefront might have been 100 feet deep, 50 feet wide, 20 feet wide, 40 feet wide. It varied. And there would be a couple of beds separated by curtains in the back. There might be a nurse at the front. But usually it was just that one doctor, and he would work his patients all day long as his hospital. And everybody had their own hospital, and they named it after themselves left and right. Today I drove by the 5th Avenue Apartments, if you're familiar with those in downtown Omaha, right off of Dodge. That was built as the Ford Hospital, upon which Dr. Ford named it after himself. And that was the last of the personalized hospitals. This joint, when the Ford Hospital was built, it had 40 rooms, one doctor, and then he hired assistants to help him. But still led off of that kind of ego saving the world thing, doctor stuff. Well, this wasn't exceptional. It wasn't phenomenal. And for a while, all of the major parts of Omaha had their own doctors, had their own hospitals. Now, of course, you know my bias is that the majorist part of Omaha, and I say that only a little bit in jest, South Omaha wasn't nearly as sophisticated as North Omaha for a very long time. And there was no West Omaha to speak of for a very long time. But North Omaha was so packed, it was so full of humanity, there was so much money to be made, that a doctor was willing to open up his hospital way up at 24th and Wirt. A doctor was willing to open up his hospital way up at ... Well, in the 1870s, there was a group of Lutherans. These Lutherans, I'll tell you, they're awesome. This group of Lutherans decided that they were going to open up a hospital with an orphanage and an old folks home, all three of them together, way up at 34th and Meredith, just off of, you can picture west of 30th and Ames. And these folks opened up an old folks home because they wanted to care for the old. That was part of their mission. And they opened up an orphanage because the orphan trains had come through Omaha and there were leftover kids. And they'd opened up a hospital. And it was all under the control of one Reverend Jorgensen. And this pastor decided, you know what, we need to grow this thing out. They named it the Emmanuel Hospital. And the Emmanuel Hospital became Omaha's biggest hospital within 50 years. When the Emmanuel Hospital eventually left North Omaha, they left 23 buildings behind. Huge! 4 new hospital buildings, each had capacity for 100 beds. Their campus covered more than 12 acres. They were not playing around. They had their own chapel. They had their own steam house. They had their own, eventually they had a place for mental health. They had a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center. Wait a second. There's only one building left out of those 22 in that whole area at 34th and Meredith. And it was the old It was an old treatment center that was built up at 36th and Meredith, and it's still there right now. It was built in the 50s. But the rest of this area has been redeveloped as a housing development. Anyway, that was the Emmanuel Hospital, and it was a magic place, but it wasn't the first hospital. The first hospital, I can't quite track it down, but I'll say that one of the oldest hospitals in all of North Omaha became eventually what was called the Wise Memorial Hospital. The Wise Memorial Hospital was opened at the turn of the 20th century, 1901, on Sherman Avenue, just south of Locust Street. Today we call that intersection 16th and Locust. And it was opened by the Jewish community, by Jewish doctors, determined to provide a place where both Jewish people and non-Jewish people, including African Americans, could come for health care. They kept it open for the next 40, 50 years, but they moved it further and further away from North Omaha. But regardless, it started right there on 16th Street at the turn of the century. Another one of the oldest ones, aside from Emmanuel, and we'll come back to Emmanuel in a minute because it plays a really important role. But another one of the oldest ones was Swedish Mission Hospital. The Swedish Mission Hospital was opened at 24th and Pratt. Now let's picture going up North 24th Street. There is an OHA tower for seniors at 24th and Pratt. There's also a Salvation Army Women's Center at 24th and Pratt. The hospital was on the northwest corner of 24th and Pratt. And it began in an old mansion, 30-room mansion that was there. Oh, did I tell you about the mansions in North Omaha? I'll have to do that another time. But when the hospital opened up in this mansion, they expanded it immediately. It was all led by Swedes from the Swedish Missionary Church. And they were determined to serve North Omaha. And they built a hospital. That hospital proved to not be big enough to really be fiscally sustainable. So instead of closing it, they reopened it as the Evangelical Covenant Hospital at the same location. And they expanded it to twice the size. Eventually, they built a whole entire hospital around it that had more than 100 rooms. That hospital kept going from 1905, eventually all the way through 1938. And it was a cornerstone of the neighborhood. Now, also closing in 1938, coincidentally or not, it's right across the street from it. Same corner, same intersection. The University of Omaha, which was started in North Omaha at 24th and Pratt. So this one intersection had a giant hospital, had a university, and had all the businesses to serve it for 2 or 3 blocks in either direction. Did I mention that North Omaha was great? It still is great, and this is one of the ways that it got there. The ending's not so hot, though. We'll get there. Right when that hospital closed in 1938, though, another hospital took its place in the same spot. This one has a longer history, though, going all the way back to the 1890s. They first opened up, I'm going to tell you what the name of it is in just a second, but they first opened up on North 16th Street, right around Lake. Eventually, they moved to 24th and Pratt, and then some other time they moved over by 40th and Dodge. It was called the Salvation Army Booth Memorial Hospital. Had a couple other names. Originally, it was called the Salvation Army Hospital for Unwed Mothers and Other Women. This was code language for teenagers who had babies, unwed mothers, and women of the profession who did not give up their profession but didn't keep their babies. And the Salvation Army would birth those babies and then shuttle them out to their next life, get them adopted out. So that hospital took over the site of the Swedish Evangelical Covenant Hospital. Methodist Hospital. We have in our minds that big, beautiful facility up by 38th and Cumming that eventually became a Salvation Army facility. Well, that actually wasn't started right there. The Methodists had tried to get a hospital going over and over and over again. One of the locations was at 38th, right on the edge of the Walnut Hill neighborhood. Beautiful Victorian mansion. Well, they were like, yeah, this is a pretty good spot. So they built and built and built and built and built. And eventually they built 5 different buildings. 2 of them still stand. And you can go see those historic buildings. They were built in the 20s. One of them was torn down just 4 or 5 years ago. Beautiful exterior that was clad inside of a steel siding from the 1950s. But that hospital opened up in 1908 right there and moved out in 1968. So it lasted quite some time. 16th and Wirt, nobody thinks about this as some kind of busy romantic place full of stuff, but it was. there were hospitals all over. One of the hospitals, right at 16th and Wirt, just off of it, it was the original Presbyterian Hospital of Omaha. Now, you might not have this on the top of your mind, but you'll be glad to know that eventually it moved down to South 10th Street and took over the Bishop Worthington House, which today is called the Red Mansion or something. Anyway, it's on 10th, across from where the Grace Bible College was, right down yonder. But the Presbyterian Hospital moved from 16th and Wirt all the way down there. So lots of these different hospitals, and really, Steve, we could just keep prattling them off. The Kuntz Park Hospital, St. Luke's Hospital, Mercy Hospital, the People's Hospital. Oh, I add question marks to my sentences, if only to imply there's more of a story there. And that's where I want to go next in this. But to know, importantly, the number that we said at the beginning, a dozen hospitals, I've expanded on it, and I've actually found evidence of 14 different hospitals in North Omaha. But I want to expand this, Steve, and not just talk about all the hospitals that people know, but I want to talk about a couple that we don't know. And we don't know them for a lot of reasons. But most importantly, Omaha's hospitals, and large, not all the time, not for everybody, but for the majority of the time, and for the majority of African Americans in Omaha, they were not allowed to be served at Omaha's hospitals into the 1960s. Not everywhere, not all the time. But it was such a problem, and it was such a reality, that there were several attempts and several segregated hospitals opened up in Omaha, specifically for African American people. Several of them on North 24th Street, all of them north of Cumming. Oh, by the way, this Jim Crow went beyond just admitting patients. It also had to do with the doctors. If you were a black doctor, you were allowed to bring your patient to the door and turn them over to the registering doctor, and never to be able to practice in the hospital itself. And that was a regular and frequent thing through the 1960s. So one of the hospitals that opened in North Omaha was called the People's Hospital, and it was opened by Dr. Aaron Manassas McMillan, and we're going to do a podcast on him later. Fascinating dude, huge history. But basically, long story short is, he was raised in North Omaha, he goes away for doctor college, comes back to North Omaha, he runs for political office and loses. Goes on mission for 25 years to Angola, builds their first ever hospital, comes back to North Omaha and decides, we need a hospital in the neighborhood. He builds a free hospital in North Omaha to serve African Americans. It succeeds for 5 years and then disappears. Dr. McMillan eventually got into other hospitals in the early 60s. But his hospital, the People's Hospital, ran for 5 years starting in 1948. And is worth knowing about. Another hospital worth knowing about is the Mercy Hospital that was at 24th and Parker. The Mercy Hospital was the first black hospital in Omaha. It opened in the 1910s and was run by a guy named Roscoe Riddle, Dr. Roscoe Riddle. Now, there were other doctors in Omaha before him, but Dr. Riddle must have rattled a few bones. Not just because he was a doctor, but because the newspapers constantly mentioned, Dr. Roscoe got in trouble this week, Dr. Roscoe Riddle got in trouble this week, and they painted him out to be some kind of corrupt doctor. In the meantime, he was running a block hospital on North 24th Street in the 1910s. Lasted 7 or 8 years, then Dr. Riddle disappears from the record. There were other facilities that were around the neighborhood and other hospitals. There were other attempts at starting hospitals. I would be remiss not to mention the Negro Women's Christian Home that was originally opened in 1907. Eventually, it was called the Omaha Colored Old Folks Home. And then eventually it was renamed for Martha T. Smith. Martha T. Smith Home for the Aged. It was all funded by the, quote, Omaha Negro Women's Christian Association, which was segregated because white women didn't want African American women inside of their club. So African American women started their own club, wanted to do charity, and started this old folks home. This old folks home was not a shallow endeavor. It started in 1907 and did not end until almost 1960. It went and went and went and went. Oh, by the way, it was down the street from the Jewish old folks home. This is how close in proximity these communities were at that time. Also worth mentioning was an attempt that really never got off the table. So it was 1914, there was another record of African-American doctors getting together, raising money for a hospital. Didn't come through. 1922, it happened again. It was an African-American fraternity that worked nationwide called the Supreme Royal Circle of Friends of the World. And they appropriated $100,000 to build a black hospital in North Omaha. And it was never built. I can't find the end of the story or where it went. So loose threads laying all around. But again, I would be remiss not to mention one specific hospital that was called the Provident Hospital. The Provident Hospital was planned to be built in North Omaha in the 1950s. Dr. Charles Davis was behind it. Charles Davis was an attorney, who was involved in a lot of different campaigns for a lot of different things. You might be familiar with his work called the Carver Bank, which he worked with a group of African-American businessmen to start a black bank on Lake Street. The building still stands today. The Carver Legacy Center is there now doing work with the African-American community to bring new income into the community. Davis himself was involved with this group of gentlemen and a few women, actually, who were working to develop a new hospital, a 100-bed hospital in the 1950s in North Omaha that was going to be called the Provident Hospital. And the Provident Hospital had architectural plans. It had black doctors lined up to work in it. It was planned, but it didn't get off the ground. Something happened in the 1950s to Mr. Davis, and I still can't quite figure out what. Now, if Davis rings a bell, that's because his daughter, Elizabeth Pittman Davis, also called Betty, was Nebraska's first African-American judge and a longtime lawyer in the community. She was so popular, and her ex-husband was Dr. Pittman, who was an African-American veterinarian, very popular throughout the community. But her father went off the radar in 1951, and the Carver Bank closed, and the Provident Hospital plans never got off the ground. Not insinuating anything, just saying I don't know what happened. So we have a lot in North Omaha's hospital history, we have a lot of stuff. More than 14 hospitals in the whole neighborhood, dozens of plants, lots of things. Today, in North Omaha, from 72nd Street east to the river, from Dodge Street north to Washington County line, there is approximately one hospital left. That's Emmanuel Hospital, way out there. We do have the Charles Drew Health Clinics, multiple locations throughout the community. There are a couple other health clinics operating. That's it. No other hospitals. After this community that was so full of healthcare, so full of health. Now, there's lots of things that we could talk about feeding into this. The most obvious of which being racism and Omaha's longevity of Jim Crow and different things like this. We could also talk about the outcomes. Lead poisoning for almost every kid that was raised in North Omaha from 1900 all the way to today. But let's not dwell on all that. Instead, let's just say this was another episode of the North Omaha History Podcast about hospitals in the neighborhood. I'd love to see your questions, comments, concerns, considerations, and otherwise on the website, and I invite you to check out the article at northomahahistory.com about the history of hospitals in North Omaha.
Thanks for listening to the North Omaha History Podcast with noted author and historian Adam Fletcher Sassy. Join us next week as Adam takes you on another guided tour through Omaha's dynamic past.